All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Lucas McMillan, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. We're going to begin actually a little early because we cannot take any more students in. Today we are gathered for the third installment of our series, Achieving the Promise, Democracy and the Informed Citizen. This is a series of events that comes to us courtesy of a grant from South Carolina Humanities, and that is the state-level organization that distributes funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So federal funding has allowed for us to do these very good things this year. And this year we join in the many programs across our country that are part of the Federation of State Humanities Council's initiative called Democracy and the Informed Citizen. And that is to give students more of an idea about how to be involved in one's community through exercises in civic engagement. I hope that you have been with us before, but if you haven't, I'm glad you're here today. And let me assure you that I hope you will continue to be involved in our ATP series. You can go to the website www.lander.edu/ATP for our upcoming events that will continue in January. Today's event is a public lecture on the Briggs v. Elliott case from 1952. This, as our speaker will explain, is one of the ways that we see a group of citizens petition the government for a change that needs to happen in society. It is a story that comes to us from the history of South Carolina. And so it is a story that you may have some knowledge of, or you may not be very knowledgeable of, but we are excited to present it to you today. Our speaker is Dr. Kimberly Richburg, Associate Professor of Political Science at Lander. Dr. Richburg is a native South Carolinian who comes from Clarendon County, the county in which this case emerges. Since she joined our faculty, she has been a leader in doing a lot of things for and with students. That includes the Pi Sigma Alpha National Political Science Honor Society, that includes being sponsored to the Political Science Association, and teaching as a specialist in American politics. She has published her research in journals about the teaching of political science and about assessing how to best do good undergraduate teaching. So we're very excited that she is here today, that she has personal connections to this case, and that we can be a part of this endeavor together to learn about civic engagement. I'm very excited to welcome to our attention, although she is no stranger to Lander, our colleague, Kimberly Richburg.
Thank you so much, Dr. McMillan, for such a nice introduction. And I've been here, what, like 13 years, so I'm definitely way beyond strangerhood. I think I'm like a piece of furniture now. Is that, I think that's pretty much about where I am. Before I begin, just a quick question. How many of you all, before you heard about this presentation, or before you took one of my classes, had ever heard anything about the Briggs versus Elliott case? Okay, some hands, but definitely significantly less than half of the room. That is not unusual. Hopefully today I can tell you all a little bit more about the case, and it's actually a bit more than a case, more about the civic engagement activities and efforts that were done that culminated in this case. And it is quite fascinating. And it is truly something that South Carolina has to be really, really proud of. We hear about Brown v. Board of Education, which I'll mention in a minute, but there was actually more to Brown than just the Brown case. There were 4 other cases that the U.S. Supreme Court decided on when it made its decision on Brown. And Briggs v. Elliott was one of those 4 other cases. Okay? So, let's talk a little bit about this. It's almost a case study in civic engagement, to be honest with you. All right. Let's go back, and during this talk, I'm going to interject some of my memories, some of my childhood memories, because Dr. Millen said I did grow up in Clarendon County. So I grew up from the age of a young child on hearing about some of the events I'm going to tell you about today, and also grew up knowing that I had relatives who were involved with this situation we're talking about today, and also had relatives, and I knew of people in the community who were involved with other civil rights activities that I won't speak specifically to today. And so I grew up as a child hearing these things. The gentleman's picture on the slide is Reverend Joseph A. Delane, and he plays a huge role in this process. I remember being young, and there was a painting, one of only 2 paintings in the church that I grew up in, which is called Spring Hill African Methodist Episcopal Church. Reverend Delane actually was the minister of that church back a long time ago. I think he started preaching there even before my dad was born. My dad was born in the early 1940s. And there's a painting of him in the entryway of the church. And I remember asking my mom a number of times, I was telling her, like, I can't remember him. She's like, no, you were too young. You would not remember him. And I knew that when I was little, every year, the trustees of the church would have this program. And they would have a program, and visitors would come, like usually a choir would come, from New York, and it was cool because it was, we saw a choir performing these songs and a level of performance that we were not used to, and this was such a cool, fun program. And they still have that program to this day, it's just that they do it on a smaller level. And as I got older, I learned that program was done in order to honor Reverend J.A. Delane. He's known as J.A. Delane because of his work in the civil rights movement. And because he was a minister at Spring Hill A&M Church, Spring Hill has continued to honor him and to honor the legacy of civil rights activity through having this yearly program. Now, some of the other memories I have from early childhood is hearing, as I mentioned a minute ago, about some relatives, a few of which were some aunts and uncles of mine who were a lot older than my dad. And I remember hearing about how it was because of the fight or their efforts with respect to integrating school, they ended up losing their jobs. And this was the big reason why some of these aunts and uncles did not live in South Carolina. My father comes from a very big family. However, growing up, roughly about half of his siblings lived in South Carolina, and I think when I grew up, he had only 2 siblings who lived in our hometown. And so this is kind of a lot for a kid to process, but I got the message that integration was something really positive, and there were some people, not just family members, some people I knew of who worked towards this, but that there was a cause for it. Okay? That's part of the larger framework. There's one relative in particular, and this is my great uncle, who was known as Uncle Eddie. He was my grandfather's brother. My grandfather's name was Pascal Richburg. One of his brothers' name was Edward E. Richburg, known as Uncle Eddie to us. I never met Uncle Eddie. He died in 1960. My dad was still in his teens when his uncle died. But I heard about Uncle Eddie throughout my whole life because I heard that he was one of the leaders. He was a minister. He was a school principal at one point, and he was one of the leaders of this huge movement to try to bring about equality in the school system for blacks and whites, and to try to help bring about the integration of the school system. So those are some of the memories that I have as a kid. So now, let's do a very, very brief history on it. I want to just make sure everybody's clear as to how we ended up setting upon this legacy of segregated public facilities, which is going to come to include schools. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Plessy versus Ferguson case and the decision. This is the case, of course, in which the gentleman, who I believe was 1/8 black, sat in a train car in Louisiana reserved for whites. He got in trouble, he challenged this, and the U.S. Supreme Court at the time ruled that it was okay to segregate races out in the public facilities as long as those facilities were equal. Let me say this again. The court ruled, now keep in mind, this is after something very important called the 14th Amendment was passed. And in the 14th Amendment, y'all heard of something called the Equal Protection Clause, which says that basically the law is supposed to protect citizens in the same way, it's supposed to protect one citizen as much as the next. While to most of our ears, it sounds like this ruling was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. You have to realize that this was near the turn of the century, in the late 1800s. A lot of communities in the South had already started to segregate the races in public facilities. And this ruling basically co-signed what had already started to happen. And this ruling set us off in the country towards a path towards racial segregation. That was actually not just confined to the South, it's just that it was more extreme in the South, okay? So, what happens after the Plessy ruling is states have a green light from the federal government, the U.S. Supreme Court. Isn't it a federal governmental institution? It is. States in this country now have a green light that they can segregate races of people as much as they want to the little heart's content. Okay? So what you see is the increased amount of segregation that happens over the years. These are the infamous pictures y'all have seen, I'm sure, the restrooms, water fountains. Even, some people think about things like this, even if you went to a lot of doctor's offices, they were segregated, okay, during this time. And a lot of those are going to remain segregated in the South up until we hit the 1950s and 60s, unfortunately. So this is what gave us the legal basis for segregating the public school system, okay? So let's bring this to the context of the South in the 1940s and 50s, because most of the events I'll talk about happened from the late 1940s on up through the 1950s. Once again, the town that I'm from, where in that town and in the area of that town, most of the events take place. You have a situation which, like many other southern places, most of the southern places, it is a very racially segregated town. I would say it was probably your typical racially segregated town. Yes, there were towns in the South, cities in the South that were not quite as segregated, some that were even more, but I think Somerton was pretty typical, okay? Also, let's keep some other things in mind in the backdrop. Do African Americans in general have access to the voting booth during the 1940s and 50s in the South? They do not. They have much greater access up north and in other places in the country, but not in the South. So this is part of the backdrop. You have racialized segregation. African Americans in general do not have very good access to the voting booth, okay? However, I will tell you that in Clarendon County, by the time you get up to the time in which I'm going to talk about in the 1940s and 50s, you have a small but significant percentage of African American citizens who have, despite all odds, despite the barriers, have actually begun to start to vote, and you have some local politicians who've actually started to court some of these African American voters at the time. But no, a majority of them were not voting in the 1940s and 50s. So, just a little bit of a quick education on the Brown case. The ruling in the Brown v. Board of Education case, it basically said that racially segregated public schools, this was unconstitutional, okay? This was a major ruling because it was the beginning of the overturning of the separate but equal doctrine that was established in Plessy versus Ferguson. So this was major. And like I said at the beginning, what a lot of people don't realize is that when the court ruled in Brown, it actually responded to 5 cases which challenged racially segregated public schools, not just one case, not just the Brown case. So let me go ahead and just say a little bit more briefly about Clarendon County. So this is maybe the fun part. How many people, is anyone in here, by the way, who's from Clarendon County? I would be so pleased as punch if there's somebody in here who's from Clarendon County. I'm looking. I guess not. I think I gave a talk similar to this a few years ago, and I believe there was 1 or 2 students from Clarendon County. I've been in Atlanta for 13 years, and to my knowledge, I only know that I've personally taught 3 or 4 students from Clarendon County, so I guess Landon needs to do some recruiting down in Clarendon County. Yeah. Maybe they can send me, or maybe not, I'm not sure. But yeah, we don't get a lot of students here at Lander from Clarendon County. There's so many colleges between here and there, they tend to go to those other schools. Clarendon County is located, let me show you the map. Oh, before I show you the map, when I say I'm from Somerton, first of all, has anybody ever been to Somerton? A few heads shaking, yeah, but not many. Somerton is a small town. I would say in size, it's comparable to like Ware Shoals or 96, maybe just a little bit larger, There are a few thousand people who live there, but what's tricky is, when you're, this is tricky in Greenwood, there are probably around 3,000, 4,000 people in the area, but a lot of those people don't live in the town limits, but they still live in the area known as Somerton, okay? Here's where it's located. It is located on the outer edge of the Midlands, okay? Y'all heard of Somerton, right? Okay, yeah. Sumter is our go-to place. Sumter is only about 30 minutes from downtown in Somerton. Yes, Somerton does have a downtown. And however, a lot of people who live in the Somerton area, like my parents and like I did when I was growing up, live outside of the area. Where I grew up, it took us about a 14, 15-minute drive to actually get into town. And I actually live only about 20 minutes from Manning. Y'all heard of Manning? Okay. Yeah, Manning's the county seat of Clarendon County. Somerton and Turbeville are the other two towns with a significant size, although they're quite a bit smaller than Manning. Okay. Just a little bit more background. I grew up there. I haven't lived there very much as an adult. My parents have spent not all of their lives there. They were both away when they were young people, like in their late teens and 20s. They spent quite a bit of time away. And they moved back to Somerton somehow because of me after I was born. I've still never gotten a great explanation for that, but whenever I ask them, well, why'd you move back? I'm like, oh, well, you were born. I was like, okay. But that's what they tell me. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the segregated public schools in Somerton, in Clarendon County. And this could go for the segregated public schools in, quite frankly, almost any southern city or southern town. Have y'all heard about the conditions of some of the schools that were reserved for blacks during this time? Y'all heard about how poor some of these conditions were, and I have a few pictures to show y'all in a second. But first of all, for a very long time, there were no buses for African American students. Now, of course, it was a time when there were no buses for students of any color. But by the time you hit the mid-late 1940s, there were buses available for white students. Okay, there were no buses available for black students, and there were not any efforts by the school district to try to provide buses for black students. Do y'all think some students had a very long distance to walk to get to school? Yeah, these are stories, and once again, I'm going to refer to some personal stories here. My father was very lucky because most of my parents were, relatively speaking, kind of lucky in this whole thing, because things started changing as they got higher up in school, so they were to benefit from some of those changes. But when they started school, there were no buses. My dad was lucky. He lived less than a mile from his school. On top of that, his sister, who was a teacher at another school, could sometimes drive him and his younger brother to get to school. My mom did not live that close to her school. She lived, even though her school was a neighborhood school, she was kind of outside the neighborhood, so I think she had to walk, I don't know, maybe about 4 miles each way to get to school, or maybe a little more than that. But the longest distances that I've heard people talk about that they had to walk to get to school, and sometimes this is from people who were older than my parents. I have an aunt by marriage on my mom's side who, when she was little, I think she would have had to walk at least 7 miles to get to school. And I have another aunt who, when she was really young, once again, much older than my parents, she had to walk, I think, about 8 miles to get to school. Now, I want you to stop and think. Now, I'm assuming a lot of you all enjoyed going to school when you went to school. But what if you had to walk 4 or 5 miles, maybe 7 miles each way to get to school? And then sometimes when you got up in the mornings, you would have to do chores. Most families in Somerton at the time were involved in farming. And when you got home, depending on what season of the year it was, you probably had to go out in the fields and work, and then get back home and try to do homework, and then get up in the morning and walk that distance again. Do y'all think that would be tough to do? It was very tough to do, and needless to say, a lot of students at this time, especially a lot of African American students, did not finish school. As a matter of fact, if you go back before the 1950s and the 40s, depending on where you live, and this is the time in the community in which, in the African American community, the schools reserved for blacks, you had community schools, okay? So there were lots of schools around, whereas for the white population, they had consolidated the schools, so they had fewer schools, but they were nicer, bigger school buildings. Yeah, a lot of African Americans did not finish high school. If you go back early enough in history, you would find that depending on where you live, for example, my maternal grandmother, she went, just put this in perspective, both of my grandmothers were born around the turn of the century. Okay? My parents are the younger kids of their parents, that's why there's so much space between them and their parents. But my maternal grandmother, and whom I never knew, But my mother says that she went as far as her school went, and that was 9th grade. She didn't have access to a school to take her further. And that happened to quite a few people. There was this a major shortage for a long time with respect to schools that were designated for African Americans. And that gets better as you go up in time, but I do want you all to realize that. But these were some of the conditions that were ever present in most of these schools. There were no buses. The building conditions were quite poor, okay? Some of these buildings, y'all, would just not make cold today. I'm sure they were hazardous in the winter. Sometimes the rooms are very, very cold. But some of the buildings look almost dilapidated. The materials the teachers had to work with were very minimal. They were oftentimes outdated. Now, I'll tell you this. Back when my parents were in school, they had books that oftentimes were outdated when they were young. And guess what? They had to pay to use those books. Yeah. Now, think about this. Think about how many of the African American families were impoverished at the time. Not all of them, but many of them were. And so now, let's say you have a few kids in school at the same time. You have to pay to either purchase or rent those books. Think about how much of a hardship that actually was for some families. And then the books that you're renting or paying for, and most people are renting them because they couldn't afford to pay for them, were old and outdated. Okay? Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that, but they had to rent their books. That's something I remember hearing my mom talk about a whole lot when I was young, when I was going through school. She was trying to make me understand how lucky it was that I did not have to pay for my textbooks. Although, of course, if you're 10 years old, you're not going to be able to pay for your textbooks. You know, my parents would have been paying, but she was trying to make that point. Now, despite the fact that there were a lot of schools out in the African American community, some of these schools were actually overcrowded. So overcrowded classrooms was a problem. There would oftentimes be teacher shortages, just space shortages. It just depended upon how many people were in your community at the time. Once again, I can draw some contrast. My father went to a small neighborhood. Y'all heard the two-room school? When he first started school as an elementary school student, he went to a two-room school, and I think they educated those. There were two teachers, and I knew both of those teachers because one of them was still teaching at the elementary school I went to, and she was a very active, still going at it. The other one was my aunt by marriage. My dad's oldest brother was married to a teacher, so my dad went to this two-room school. One of the two teachers was his sister-in-law. So how do you handle that when you get in trouble? Yeah. My dad says, he's like, oh, she was so strict. I'm like, yeah, you probably deserved it. But yeah, your sister-in-law, who's like about 20 years older than you, is one of the two teachers. Those two teachers had to handle about 3 grades in each room. And y'all, they had some students, keep in mind, this is a farming community, some students were not fortunate, and they were a couple of years late starting school. You had some students who started on time, couple, like my father was fortunate, he was able to start school a year early, and who were ready to go. And then you had other students just anywhere in between, and this was a very, very challenging environment. And yet you have almost no materials to work with. You barely have a building. Okay. My mom lived in a bigger neighborhood called St. Paul. By the way, I came from a neighborhood called Spring Hill. In St. Paul, there were more people. So their school was a lot bigger, and they had at least one section per every grade. She says for every year they went there. So that was kind of an advantage that the teachers certainly were not as overworked, okay? But there were all sorts of situations you could run into. Now, as I'm sure you've heard, there was a lot more money spent on the white schools versus the black schools. In Clarendon County at the time, in this school district, anywhere from 3 to 4 times as much money was spent on educating white children as was spent on educating black children. Okay, so that pretty much explains these dilapidated school buildings and conditions. Now let me show you a couple of pictures. Okay, it's not the clearest picture, but I think you can get the idea. Up top here is Somerton High School. This was the high school that was reserved for whites. By the way, I went to that school when I was in school, and after the school system integrated, they turned that building into the middle school, so I went there for middle school. But this is a very different looking building from this building. This is an earlier version of Scotts Branch High School, which was one of the high schools reserved for blacks. Everybody, I know the picture's kind of fuzzy, but can everybody kind of see the difference there? Yeah, pretty big difference. Now, this is a picture of an elementary school that was reserved for whites. Okay, pretty decent looking school building, right? Yeah, for late 1940s, yeah, pretty nice looking school building. Now, here are a couple pictures of elementary schools that were reserved for blacks. Okay, this is a picture of Liberty Hill Colored School. This is a school in the, near Liberty Hill. This would have been your school building. Okay, that was your building. Okay, this is another picture here. I think from a different angle. It looks like they actually had snow in them. They didn't get snowed out, but they got it. So those were just a few pictures just to show you how the stark contrast between the conditions of the building. So now I'm going to say a little bit about some key persons in the situation. Okay, I've already mentioned to you Reverend Joseph J.A. Delane. He was a minister and a community leader. And Reverend Delane is actually going to be the one who kind of spearheads this whole effort to bring about equality in education. He supposedly got inspired from going to an NAACP meeting in Columbia and came back with the idea of reforming the school system, or trying to make efforts to try to bring about a reform of the school system. His wife, by the way, was a teacher, okay, in the school system, so he knew all well what the conditions were like. Mr. Levi Pearson, he is a parent, and he's going to be the first name I'm going to mention as we go through the process, because he's a parent who has children in the school system, and he's going to be the first parent's name who's going to be attached to an effort to challenge the system. Now, Briggs, of course, Mr. Harry Briggs Sr. and Ms. Eliza Briggs. These are the Briggs for whom Briggs v. Elliott is named after. They also had several, their children were also involved in these efforts, but they're a couple, and they were concerned members of the community and concerned parents who wanted a better education for their kids. Now, Reverend E.E. Richburg, this is Dr. Richburg's great uncle. Okay, his name is Reverend Edward E. Richburg, but I know him as Uncle Eddie. He was a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and during much of the time of these events, he actually was a minister at Liberty Hill AME Church, which was actually still is to this day the biggest African Methodist Episcopal Church in our district. And my mom, by the way, went to that church. So years before she even met my father, she went to my dad's uncle's church, which is kind of interesting. So that's the minister she grew up with during her childhood. He was a principal. He worked as a principal in Orangeburg County. Okay, and he actually lived there for a while, worked there for a while. Now, Justice J. Reid, I'm going to say more about him in a few minutes, but he is a federal judge who's going to come to play a very crucial role in this process. And finally, I'm sure y'all heard of Thurgood Marshall. Yeah, Thurgood Marshall is best known as the first African American to be on the U.S. Supreme Court. But where did he really get his start? He started off as an attorney, and he worked as an attorney for the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. And he's going to be an attorney who's going to work with the leaders of this effort. And NAACP lawyers are going to be the ones who are going to help them fight, in this process. All right, so let's let the challenges begin. 1947, Mr. Levi Pearson. A lawsuit is filed by Mr. Levi Pearson against the Clarendon County School District. It was district number 22 at the time, demanding school buses for African American children. Remember I said there were no buses? Okay. And Reverend J.A. Delane, he has done a lot of work behind the scenes here because he had the mindset of challenging these inequities in the school systems. And Mr. Levi Pearson put himself out there and said, well, okay, well, I want to be part of this. I want to help start this. We need buses for our kids. Our kids have to walk way, way too far to get to school. Okay? So, they filed a lawsuit. Was this lawsuit successful? No, it was not. It was actually thrown out because of a technicality. And you know what that technicality was? Mr. Levi Pearson, where he lived, put him slightly outside of the school district's official boundary, just slightly. And so the case was thrown out. So a sigh of relief from the school district, like, whew, technically we don't have to deal with this anymore, okay? Well, that was wrong. Next were efforts to actually do a formal petition. Now let me just say something right quick about Mr. Levi Pearson. The moment he actually filed this lawsuit, from that moment on, his life got very difficult, okay? He was a farmer, as many people were in the community, and Mr. Pearson had a tough time making it because people did not want to do business with him, okay? So from that time on, it's like his name got stained. Others in the community, a lot of African American members of the community, thought he was doing a great thing. However, when it came to a lot of the white business owners, as you're going to see, they're going to play a huge role in this. Mr. Levi Pearson's name was mud. He had a hard time getting people to even buy his crops. He cut timber at one point, and nobody would buy it. This is a sign of a lot of reactions that are going to come. So in 1949, a group of people, which turns out to be a group of 100 people really, actually draw up a petition which are going to demand equal education in terms of facilities, materials, equipment, and teacher salaries, things I just spoke about. But they're making a broader appeal this time. This goes way beyond just asking for school buses. They are appealing here to the guarantee of equal protection under the law of the 14th Amendment. Okay? At this point, even before this point, Thurgood Marshall, who's an NAACP lawyer, advises the persons that they need to get 20 signatures to get this petition really taken seriously, and they were able to get 100 signatures. 5 times as many signatures as they were told they really needed to get to really start this ball rolling. And I know you can't read these names, but these are the names of the 100 petitioners. Okay? Now, do y'all think these petitioners' lives started to change? Unfortunately, their lives started to change, and a lot of those changes were not good. Okay? So now I'm going to stop and show you a couple of pictures and just say a little bit, just point out some people on this picture. This is one of a couple of very infamous pictures that were taken. What's happening at this point is that there have been meetings that have taken place at various churches in the African American community, most of those being African Methodist Episcopal churches. There was also some meetings that took place at Talcott Baptist Church, and where they met was pretty strategic. 2 of those churches were really big, so they could reach out to a lot of people through meeting at those churches. And keep in mind, at this point in time in the Black community, most people are connected to a church, even if they don't attend that church regularly. So this is a good way to try to reach people through the institution of the church. There have been meetings among the leaders of the groups. There have been meetings with the leaders locally, with other members of the NAACP at the state and national level. There's so many meetings that are going on. There's some meetings that are going to take place at people's homes, in people's homes. They had to be careful about where they actually met, okay? They also had to kind of keep their eye out also for if there was anybody who came to their meetings who maybe just seemed a little bit suspicious, and I'll try to remember to tell y'all something about that later on. But yeah, this was very serious business. Now I'm going to go to the next picture and just point out who a few people are. Okay? Well, where's Dr. Richburg's uncle? Where's Uncle Eddie? This is Uncle Eddie right here. The gentleman at the top right, at the last row at the top right hand of the picture. The gentleman next to him is Reverend J.A.D. Lane. Okay? The gentleman down here is Harry Briggs Sr. Okay? Now, this lady right here, the 4th lady from the right at the bottom, her name is Rebecca Richburg. So y'all think I might be related to her too? Maybe. And by the way, I don't know that I'm not related to all Richburgs in Clarendon County, but this one I'm related to because she, by marriage, her husband, whose name is Hazel Richburg, and I knew both of them, by the way, before they died. Her husband was my dad's first cousin, although he was a lot older than my father, okay? So that was Mr. Hazel's wife, Miss Rebecca. And she also signed this petition, okay? Now I'll try to remember to say a little something about her interesting situation near the end of my presentation. So there I just wanted to point out a few, put a few names to a few faces. Do y'all also notice there are a few children on here? Yeah, these were children. Any kids you see on here, their parents also signed the petition. These were kids who were basically being mobilized along with the adults to support an equal education. All right, their lives changed. Okay, here are some of the things that happened. A lot of people got a lot of threats, various types of threats. A lot of jobs were lost, y'all. Most of those people on that picture you saw, and most of the people's names, those 100 names, most of those people either lost jobs themselves or their close family member lost jobs, okay? Do y'all think that was an easy thing for them to lose a job? No, this was very, very tough. In addition to losing jobs, they also lost access to a lot of the businesses in the community. Most of the businesses in Clarendon County, most in Somerton, were white-owned. Yes, there were a few minority-owned businesses, but not a whole lot. There were some businesses, like banks or stores. Some banks refused to do business with anybody who was associated with this petition effort. Now, let me get y'all's minds out of the current plastic credit card world, okay? This is before that world. Back during this time, it was not unusual in many communities across the country. If there were stores, people would often buy things on credit and then pay for it when they got the money. And when you live in a farming community, you don't necessarily, how it worked back then was that you didn't get like a check coming in every month. You got paid when you sold what you grew. So you got money coming in during certain parts of the year, but you didn't have much money coming in during other parts of the year. So a lot of people would use their line of credits in these various businesses. What do you think happened to the line of credit if it was found out that you signed this petition? Was it still good? Most of that was gone. Most businesses refused to offer these petition signers and their close family members lines of credit anymore. And even some other just really extreme things happen, such as sometimes, you know how if you make a purchase on an expensive item, you pay for it along and along typically? There were a few people who got like balance due notices when they actually have more time to pay for what they purchased, okay? There were a few people who were told that they owed money on things that they had already been paid for, okay? So a main weapon of resistance here is financial. This was a main weapon of resistance, and it's going to be for about 10 to 15 years, unfortunately. Now, violence, okay? There was the threat of violence from the beginning, but in particular, there were a few people who seemed to have been more of a target of the threat of violence, and Reverend J.A. Delane was one of them, okay? Reverend J.A. Delane was actually the person who sort of spearheaded this in many ways, and he was known as the person who spearheaded it. Now, there were many other people working with this. My uncle was also one of the ministers, one of the community leaders, who was a leader of this. But it seems like Reverend J.A. Delane really kind of won that poster child award for, oh, it's you. You're the one who's trying to put this all together. So he received many threats. He and his family and their possessions were the victims of violent attacks, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those near the end of the presentation. Now, in the white community in Somerton, particularly if you were in some position of power, if you were a business owner, do y'all think there was a lot of pressure on you to not deal with these petition signers? There was a lot of pressure on you. If you were a white person and you owned a business, there was a lot of pressure on you to not work with these petition signers, okay? And it's important to understand that because probably some of these business owners who refused to do business with petition signers really probably didn't want to refuse to do business with them, but they yielded to the social pressure. Like, you don't do business with the petition signers. And in a larger context, if you're in the NAACP during this time, you also suffer some of these things, and many businesses would not do business with you. Just to give you an example of just how much it hurts to have businesses not do business with you in a small community. Remember, this is a farming community. Back during this time, if you, say, grew cotton, which a lot of people did, you would take your cotton to a gin house, okay? They'd have the seeds separated from the lint, and then your cotton would get put into bales, and then you would try to sell your cotton at the gin house. Unfortunately, after this started, at one point, I think, and I don't remember how many gin houses there were in the Somerton area, but there were a few of them. There was only one gin house when the owner said, yes, you can come bring your cotton here. He was open to it. He said, yes, I will still do business with you. The others have refused to do business with the black farmers, okay? So it's a problem if you're growing a crop, but you can't process your crop, you can't process your cotton, and then if you can't process it, how can you sell the cotton? That's going to be a problem, big problem. All right, so let's go to up to 1950. And given that there had been no action from the Clarendon County School Board with request to this petition's request for equal facilities / better facilities, they decided to take the case to U.S. District Court. And here's where they encountered Judge J. Wade's Waring. How many of y'all had ever heard of Judge Waring? Just a few people. And guess what? He dismissed the case. So is this the case of a judge here who is dismissing the case because he's just not going to deal with this quest for equal facilities in the school system? I'm not going to get involved with that. They're not going to get anywhere. No, this was a good kind of dismissal because they stumbled upon a judge who was very sympathetic to the idea of equal education, equal facilities, and he gave them some very crucial advice. Judge Waring dismissed the case without prejudice and Thurgood Marshall was one of the lawyers at the time and told them, basically, this is not an exact quote, but your problem, your main problem is not a lack of equality. Your main problem is segregation. The lawyers knew what he meant. That was a sign to them that what they needed to do was fight segregation. They needed to fight for desegregation. That was probably going to be the only means that we're going to be able to achieve this level of equality for the school systems. Okay? So one thing you might want to think about is, what if the judge that they dealt with at this point, what if he was a judge who had the dominant attitudes that most judges in South Carolina had at the time? How difficult of a stumbling block would that have been? Okay, we don't know, but they had a bit of luck here. Now a little bit more about Judge J. Waring. He was from Charleston, South Carolina, federal court judge. There were some signs before this case got to him that he was very sympathetic to the idea of equality and very sympathetic to the idea of integration. He'd done some weird things. For example, he actually started integrating his courtrooms. You know, he didn't have blacks sitting on one side or white sitting on another side, so that was seen as really weird, okay, at the time. He and his wife, he's married to his second wife now, they started having black families over to their house. Do y'all think that went over very well in the Charleston elite community? No, no, this is the 1940s, like what's wrong with them, okay? He also made a couple of rulings during his time in the years before this case came to him that sent the message that this is a judge who's very progressive thinking, who seems to really believe in equality, and who's trying to do something about it. He made rulings saying, for example, that white and black teachers should get paid the same amount of money. He made a ruling which made it difficult for the South Carolina Democratic white primaries to take place. And there was a time in which the Democratic Party, which was dominant in the South at the time, would try to have, and they actually had all white primaries, and if you weren't white, you couldn't participate. So, so this is very interesting, very interesting. Now, so you get here a gentleman who's a federal judge who's already behaving very contrary to social norms, and he's applying this to how he does his job. So, we'll come back to Judge Waring. So basically, they take his advice, and from this point on, they're actually trying to challenge the doctrine, the constitutionality of the separately equal doctrine. Because see, what has happened here is that the main initial goal was to try to help bring about equality. Now that goal has modified, and now the main goal is to challenge the constitutionality of it and to try to help bring about integration or desegregation. And I say that because desegregation was a term that was used before we started using the term integration. So this is a shift in strategy. It's even a bigger thing to take on. So in 1950, which is actually the earliest date that the Briggs v. Elliott case was filed, there are multiple dates here. The case was filed in federal court, and it challenged the whole doctrine of separately equal, and they used 20 of those 100 petitioners' names. They left off the children, and they only wanted to use people who signed the petition who had parents in the school system at the time. So they use 20 names. Now, if you go to Clarendon County, when people talk about this, people will sometimes tell you that this case, like, it all started here. But you bring up anything about Brown v. Board, like, it all started here. You bring up anything about school integration, it all started here. What they're referring to is the fact that of those 5 cases that were decided upon when Brown was decided, Briggs was the case that actually got filed the earliest. Okay? But yeah, so just be prepared for that. We go to Clarendon County, they're going to say, oh, it started here first. Although in reality, and since no one in here is from Clarendon County, I guess y'all won't go back and tell. In reality, now everybody's going to go back and tell, right? In reality, there have been, around a dozen or so cases in U.S. history that had challenged the lack of equal schools going all the way back to the 1800s. Okay? This is just a picture of Mr. Harry Briggs, Ms. Eliza Briggs, and Reverend J. Delane. And you might wonder, well, who is Elliott? Briggs v. Elliott. This is Elliott. He was actually the superintendent of the school system. Now, in 1951, the case was heard in U.S. District Court by 3 judges, and Judge Waring is one of those judges. They lost the case, okay? However, Judge Waring dissented, which means that he disagreed with the ruling. Y'all, he wrote a 28-page dissent. When you write a 28-page dissent on a case like this, you've really got some points you want to get across. And I have a quote here. Well, I'll show you the quote in a second, but basically, Judge Waring still has this standpoint that segregation is an equality, and he believes that you're not going to be able to achieve equality in the school system as long as you are segregated. I want you to see his quote. This is his quote. And I'm going to let you take a minute and read it. I won't read the quote, but I want you to actually read his quote. And I want you to keep in mind, we're early 1950s. This is a federal judge, okay, from Charleston, who said this. Okay. Judge Waring was not shy about his beliefs. He stood by them. He said them. It may have ticked some people off, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what happened with him near the end too. But he stood to his beliefs. Okay? Now, here's what did come out of that case. The U.S. District Court, although they decided against Briggs, they basically put the responsibility back in the school district. And they said that, yes, the African American schools are very unequal to the white schools. We can see that. So we believe that some improvements, the local school district needs to make some improvements with regard to the black schools. Now, there is some progress made here. And a couple examples of those are, guess what? After that, the black schools get buses. But here's the thing. They don't get a lot of buses initially, because I think, matter of fact, my dad confirmed this just this morning. Initially, they got buses. They got 3 buses for all the black schools in this district. Just 3 buses, okay? But they got a couple buses. There was also a new at least one new elementary school that got built fairly early. So generally speaking, there was some improvements, still nowhere equal, but some improvements. And like I said, my parents were kind of lucky in the sense that they had a chance to come around when these improvements had actually started. Okay. Now, in 1951, Briggs et al., they appealed their case to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court initially sent the case back, okay, to the South Carolina's District Court. Now, what happens over the next couple of years is that a number of cases are being presented to, a number of cases are popping up around the country, and the U.S. Supreme Court sees that this issue of an inequality in schools and segregated schools is just too big to ignore, basically. It's just too large to ignore. So what they do in 1954 is that the U.S. Supreme Court finally issues a ruling on Brown. That's the infamous ruling that I'm sure all of you all have heard about. And the U.S. Supreme Court says, yes, it is indeed a violation of the 14th Amendment to segregate the races in the public school systems. It violates the Equal Protection Clause. And they agreed, said what Judge Waring had said, a few years earlier, segregation was in effect discrimination. So these segregated schools, the order is that these segregated schools are going to have to desegregate. And some of y'all may be familiar with the fact that in this case, there was evidence presented from psychologists who had interviewed kids who had gone to some of these black schools. And they found out that through their interviews and studies of the kids, that young black children were developing senses of inferiority. For example, they would show kids pictures, I think, of like whites and blacks, and then ask them which was better, and a lot of kids thought, well, the whites were better. And the whole idea here is that when you try to raise an educated child in a segregated environment, which is very unequal to another school system, you are doing things that are going to be psychologically damaging to that child. And Judge Warren said that it's possible that some kids may not ever overcome that. So you're developing feelings of inferiority. This is a picture of Chief Justice Earl Warren. And by the way, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided Brown, it was a 9-0 decision. I just want to read you a portion of a quote from Earl Warren with respect to this ruling. Okay? He said, "Today, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. Compulsory school attendance laws and the great expenditures for education both demonstrate our recognition of the importance of education to our democratic society." I'm going to skip on here. I want to read you the last two portions. To separate, and here he's talking about children in grade and high schools, to separate them from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to ever be undone. Whatever may have been the extent of psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, this finding is amply supported by modern authority. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs and others similarly situated are deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Okay? Very, very, very powerfully meaningful words. So, now the Brown case has been won. Briggs has been won. So let me just briefly say a little bit about what happens nationally and what happens locally. And then I'm going to end by telling you what happened to those key players involved. I think y'all have probably gotten the memo that it's going to take nationally to really have substantial desegregation of schools that were formerly segregated in this country. It's going to take almost 20 years, into the early 1970s, early mid-70s. Okay, that's quite a long time. So it takes a long time. Now, in terms of the Clarendon School District, the one in Somerton, in a nutshell, this is basically what happens. After the Brown ruling, once again, there is an increase in the improvement of facilities of the schools. More schools get built over time. They close down a lot of these little neighborhood schools and consolidate the schools better. However, like most places in the country, there is no immediate integration. As you get into, and I can't remember exactly what year, in the 1960s, and here's the situation you have. You have a small town, which has now 2 high schools, Scotts Branch and then Somerton High School, a town that doesn't need 2 high schools. A few African American students decide that they want to enroll in the all-white Somerton High School, and a few of them do, and a few of them graduate. As a matter of fact, I know personally 2 people who went to that school and who graduated from there. But this is what happens. The white students, as you move up in time, as the school district integrates, I put that in quotes, the white students actually pull out of the old Somerton High School. The school ends up being closed down. Okay? And once again, this was kind of problematic because in a town that small, you do not need 2 high schools. And most whites who pulled out started going to a new private school that opens up. And so Somerton is basically left, this Clarendon district is left with still very segregated schools. Although now they're not segregated by law. And unfortunately, there was very, very little diversity in the school system going through the 70s, the 80s. Even when I was there were very few persons who were not black, who were students. There were a few, not many. The school district was more successful, though, at integrating its employees, because we did have a significant number of employees who were not black. So there was some progress on that level. So, as unfortunately a number of schools are in the country, it remained an unofficially kind of segregated school, although it was not segregated by law, with some exceptions in between. Now, what has happened over the past 10 years or so is that that district has had more non-black students than it used to have. I think over the past few years, typically the district has 90% black students, and then maybe anywhere from, I guess, it also varies depending on what school you're at, but anywhere between, I think, maybe 8, usually less than 10% of students who are not black. And here I don't mean just white students, but students who are Hispanic, students who are Asian too. But that's the short story of that. Now, I want to get back to what happened to the people involved. What happened to them? Okay, Mr. Levi Pearson was an early forerunner of this. His life was difficult, y'all, for a long time. I believe he stayed around. I don't think he left town, but he had a rough time for about 10 or 15 years. A lot of community members, from what I read and from what I was told, really did chip in to try to help him out, which was really, really good. But his life was really rough. Harry and Eliza Briggs, they both lost their jobs, okay, when they got involved in this effort. Harry Briggs, I think they both left town for a little while, but Harry Briggs left town first, moved to be able to get a job, to be able to work and support himself. They both eventually moved back. When I was in middle school, I knew who they were. I didn't really know them, but Miss Briggs, she worked in the cafeteria at the middle school. And I remember when, like, if we were talking about something in class that was relevant to this, some kids who hadn't heard about it would be like, Miss Briggs? You mean Miss Briggs in the cafeteria? The teacher would be like, yeah, that's her. And some students had a hard time just fathoming the fact that, oh my gosh, wow, she was involved in all of that. But Miss Briggs was very quiet. She was very quiet. And I think Mr. Harry Briggs came to one of our classrooms one day and spoke to us. I'm pretty sure in middle school. I'm pretty sure he did. Rebecca Richburg, this is my cousin who was married to, well, by marriage, she was married to my cousin Hazel. She signed a petition. Her husband did not. This is an interesting situation. Her husband Hazel actually worked at what was called a grits mill in town, and his wife signed, he did not. He was very fortunate that he was able to keep his job. We're not exactly sure how he was able to keep his job, but granted, he wasn't the one who signed the petition, so that may have had something to do with it. But they did not move. They stayed around. But of course, they still suffered under this. One interesting thing is that because Rebecca's husband worked at that mill, the owners of the mill told him, he was not able to do business with anybody for quite some time who either was in the NAACP or who was involved in this effort, which meant that he could not do business with his uncle, who was my grandfather, because my granddad was in NAACP and was also an activist. But my family totally understood the situation. But this is just how bad this was. Reverend Richburg, Uncle Eddie. Uncle Eddie unfortunately died in 1960. He was middle-aged when he died. He didn't live until old age. He had been sick for a while, and he died. He, of course, like the other petitioners, they suffered. A lot of businesses wouldn't do business with them. He had a daughter who was young, who was teaching in the district at the time. Do y'all think she was able to keep her job? No, she was fired. Okay, his daughter was fired. By the way, Uncle Eddie has a few relatives in Greenville, South Carolina. He had a daughter and a son, both of whom went on to pursue careers in education. His son, whose name was Albert Richburg, worked in the school systems in Greenville, South Carolina. Okay, but he died decades ago. He also did not make it into old age. His daughter died this year, and she spent most of her time teaching in the Florence-Darlington area. Her name was Juanita Richburg. Judge Waring. Okay, Judge Waring retired from the bench from being a judge in the 1950s. Before, he and his wife eventually, his second wife, by the way, was from Michigan. And her mindset was very, not much like the mindset of many persons who were in the white elite in Charleston. They were very in sync at this point with their progressive attitudes. They moved to New York. Do y'all think it was easy for Judge Waring to stay in Charleston? He was not accepted by the community. His house was attacked, okay? They were threatened. They moved to New York, and he died in 1968. They buried him in Charleston, but he stayed committed for the remainder of his life to the causes of equality and civil rights. But he left Charleston, which is kind of sad when you have to leave a place that you actually like being, maybe even love being, when you start standing up for what you believe is a good cause for the community. But that happened to him, and it did happen to quite a few people. Okay, Reverend J. A. Delane. This is a whole other story in itself, but very briefly. Reverend Delane, unfortunately, was the target of many threats. When he lived in Somerton, at one point, in addition to the threats, his house was burned down by arsonists. To this day, we don't know who burned the house down. Things became very unsafe for him in Somerton. There was an incident where his daughter actually wrote a book about her father and about the situation. There were a group of men who were planning an attack on him. And one of the men's wives heard the men talking, and she thought this was just awful. She, in secret, sent word to Reverend Delane to tell him that you're about to be attacked on such and such a date at such and such a place. Okay? So thanks to the wife, one of the men who was conspiring to attack him, he was able to not be in that place. He eventually had to leave Somerton. It was just too dangerous for him and his family. So how many of y'all know about Lake City? Okay, Lake City. He moved to Lake City, and he started pastoring a church there. He was the victim of attacks in Lake City also. People would ride by, shoot at the parsonage, which was the house he was living in because he was the minister. Their house had been shot at a number of times. One night, when his house got shot at, he actually shot back, and the bullets hit the car. And there are multiple stories about this, but I'm going to only relate to you what his daughter says in her book. She says that her father was told by the police chief that, because he complained that people were shooting at his house, at his family. And he said the police chief told him, next time it happens, shoot back, try to mark the car. That way we can figure out who the people are because the car will be shot up. Y'all think that's what happened? No. When he shot back, from that point on, he had to leave town. He was basically, he fled town. His family joined him later on, but he actually fled town in a car and drove to the Florence area first. And then he made his way up to New York, and his family moved later on. After he shot at that car and hit the car, and I think supposedly a couple of the men inside were hit, but I think his daughter says that I think she thought they were hit by some of the, like they were wounded, a little slightly wounded by some of the metal of the car or something. But a warrant was put out for his arrest. J. Delane never came back to South Carolina for the rest of his life. He died in 1974. Do y'all know when that warrant, when they did away with that warrant? Does anybody know? In the year 2000. Okay? Here's the thing. His daughter says in the book he never came back. We've always heard he never came back. Whether he snuck back to see his family, because he still had family in South Carolina. We don't know. If he snuck back, it was a well-guarded secret. But he stayed away. He went on, pastored another church, and basically stuck to his beliefs and kept doing what he was doing. But his family, and then after living in New York, they eventually settled in the Charlotte area in North Carolina. And he has a son and a daughter who's still living. One of his sons is now dead. So that's basically what happened to some of these key players. But I think for the petition signers in general, you had three categories of what happened. Some stayed and suffered consequences for years. Some left, a lot went up north, and then came back after things were better. Like once you hit the mid-late 60s, things had improved. Some actually left town briefly, or further family would leave town to try to make ends meet, basically. That's basically what happened to the petitioners in a couple categories. Now, this, and like I said, the effects, the retaliation didn't just happen for a couple of years. It went on for 10 or more years. Now, just a few other memories before I close. I know we're running out of time. In the night, you might ask, well, why don't more people know about Briggs versus Elliott? Well, more people know about this now than used to. In the 1980s is when there was sort of an awareness that people need to talk about this. People need to talk about the really important role that Clarendon County played in the Brown Board of Education decision. So it was during this time that the petitioners and people involved in the efforts, the leaders, began to be recognized with awards and in ceremonies. And tributes were started to be held. When I was in middle school in the 1980s, I won't say what year, actually I don't remember what year this happened in, I was actually the part of a play, of a production based on Briggs v. Elliott. Okay, and I must say, we kind of knew what we were doing then, but looking back at it now, wow, I wish somebody had videotaped that play. What we did, we were so proud to be doing it, and a lot of my classmates and I, we learned more about what had actually happened. A lot of us had known something. And I know a group of my friends who were into writing plays at that time, they wrote the play. Somehow I got designated as a narrator, so I was a narrator, I gave the history, I gave the updates. I didn't play a character, I was the narrator. And we put on this play at my middle school assembly program. The community was invited. We actually had a few people who were family members, and I can't remember if any of the petitioners themselves at that point. Yeah, I think a couple of them came, because Ms. Briggs and her husband, they were living, they came. And it was a real proud moment for us to put on that play. And I'm so sorry, I don't know if anybody has a copy of the play anymore, but yeah, that's a very fond memory that I have looking back at this. And this is a picture of one of the tributes to those 20 petition signers. This tribute is in the yard of Liberty Hill AME Church, which is located in the St. Paul area of Somerton. There's a Briggs Delane Foundation Center that opened up a few years back. There's I think it's called, I might be mixing the names up in order, but there's I think a Pearson Briggs Delane stretch of the highway here on 95 that's been named. So locally in the Somerton area, in the Clarendon County area, but especially in the Somerton area, a lot of people are aware of this, and more people are aware of this than used to be. But now you can actually go amaze your friends and tell them about the hugely important role that South Carolina played in the Brown v. Board of Education case. And you can also ponder a little bit about all these various activities, this level of civic engagement, civic involvement. Unfortunately, a lot of these people paid high prices. And that it is that way sometimes if you really want to make a change and make a difference. But there are a lot of things, ways in which we can get civically engaged and involved, and we are probably not going to have to pay nearly as high of a price as what they did. So thank you very much.